"Stop that illegal digging immediately." The HOA. Karen screamed this and called cops on me while I was just digging a post hole at my ranch. A simple fence repair on my own property. Yet she turned it into a neighborhood crisis. But she had no idea what she'd just started. 5 minutes later, everything changed. Turns out, when you mess with the wrong neighbor's family land, when you think HOA power makes you untouchable, the universe has interesting ways of teaching lessons. What happened to her $4 million mansion? Well, that's where this story gets really interesting. Comment where you're watching this unfold Saturday morning. 6 a.m. I was sitting on my porch with my first cup of coffee, looking out over the land my father left me. The morning air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I planned out the day's project. Simple enough task: replace 50 feet of old fence line that termites had been slowly destroying for the past year. I'd been putting it off, but the posts were starting to lean, and a good storm would probably knock the whole section down. My dad used to say, "Son, there are two kinds of problems in this world. The ones you fix early and the ones that fix you later." He was a man who believed in taking care of things the right way through proper channels with patience and respect for the law. Justice comes through the system, not through your fists. He'd tell me whenever I got frustrated as a kid. Looking back now, I realize how much those words would mean to me in the week that followed. I fired up my little Kubota excavator around 7:30 a.m. and started digging the first post hole. The work was straightforward, methodical. Dig down 3 feet, set the post packet with concrete, move to the next spot. I was about 2 hours in taking a water break next to my Ford pickup when I saw her marching across the property line like she owned the place. Darlene Hartwell, 52 years old, president of our Homeowners Association and owner of the 8,000 square foot mansion that sat next to my modest ranch house like a cruise ship, parked next to a fishing boat. She was wearing a pink silk robe and Louis Vuitton slippers, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning sun. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that wealthy people use when they're about to lecture someone they consider beneath them. "You are in direct violation of HOA Covenant 4.2b regarding aesthetic sight lines. I am the president of this homeowners association. I am the law around here." I set down my water bottle and walked over to meet her, keeping my voice calm and respectful. "Morning, Darlene. I'm just replacing some old fence posts on my property line. Everything's within my boundaries, and I have all the proper permits." But Darlene wasn't interested in permits or property lines. She pointed toward her mansion, its marble columns gleaming in the sunlight, the infinity pool sparkling behind manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salary. "Any construction visible from my property requires pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. You should have submitted plans, environmental impact studies, and aesthetic compatibility reports." I pulled out my phone and showed her the county survey map, pointing to the clearly marked property boundaries. "These posts are 15 feet inside my property line, Darlene. I don't need HOA approval to maintain my own fence." Her face flushed red, and that's when I knew this conversation was about to go sideways. What I didn't know then was the real reason for her fury. See, this land used to belong to her family. 10 years ago, when her husband Gary's construction company went bankrupt, they were forced to sell their 50-acre ranch to my father for $800,000. It was a fire sale way below market value, but they needed the money fast. Now Gary had rebuilt his business, they were wealthy again, and Darlene had never gotten over losing what she considered her family's legacy. She'd approached me twice since inheriting the property, offering to buy it back. Both times I'd politely declined. This fence wasn't just about aesthetics. This was about control, about getting back what she thought belonged to her. "You listen to me, young man," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the sheriff's department right now. You're using dangerous heavy machinery without proper authorization, and I feel threatened by your aggressive behavior." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Aggressive behavior, Darlene. I'm digging holes on my own property." But she was already dialing 911, and I could hear her voice changing, becoming dramatic and breathless. "Yes, I need immediate assistance. I have a neighbor using dangerous equipment and threatening me with violence. I feel unsafe in my own home." 20 minutes later, Sheriff Martinez pulled into my driveway. I'd met him a few times around town. A decent guy with 20 years of experience dealing with everything from drunk drivers to domestic disputes. He was probably in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of tired expression that comes from seeing too much human stupidity. "Morning, Art," he said, stepping out of his patrol car. "Got a call about some kind of disturbance over here." I handed him my property deed, the county survey, and the building permits I'd pulled 2 weeks earlier. Sheriff Martinez studied the documents carefully, then walked the fence line himself, checking the measurements against the survey markers. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, turning to Darlene, "everything here appears to be in order. Mr. Thompson is working well within his property boundaries with proper permits." But instead of backing down, Darlene doubled down on her story. "Officer, he's been hostile and threatening. Just because he has paperwork doesn't mean he can terrorize the neighborhood." Sheriff Martinez looked at me with an expression that said he'd been through this exact scenario more times than he cared to count. "Not my first HOA rodeo," he muttered under his breath. "Here's where things took a turn that still makes my blood boil. Even though I was 100% in the right, even though I had every permit and legal document needed, Sheriff Martinez still had to follow county protocol for neighbor disputes. Art, I'm going to need you to temporarily cease operations while we complete a full review. County regulations require a 24 to 48-hour cooling-off period for property line disputes." He took the keys to my excavator and handed me a formal warning citation. "I know this is frustrating, son, but I have to follow procedure." Darlene's smile was pure triumph as she watched the sheriff drive away with my equipment keys in his pocket. I was standing there in my own yard holding a piece of paper that essentially grounded me from working on my own property because my neighbor had thrown a tantrum. "You should learn to be more cooperative with your community," she said, adjusting her silk robe. "This neighborhood has standards and I intend to maintain them." I looked her straight in the eye, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something shift inside me. My dad's voice echoed in my head. "Sometimes, son, the system takes time to work, but when it does, it works completely." "I'll remember your face, Darlene," I said quietly, "and you'll remember mine too." The way her smile faltered just slightly told me she'd heard something in my voice that she hadn't expected. Something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. What's Art planning to do with that threat? Drop a comment if you think Art should fight back or just move away. Let me know what you would do. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in my kitchen staring at the formal warning citation and trying to figure out my next move. That's when I heard a knock on my door. It was my neighbor Linda, an elderly Vietnamese woman who'd lived 2 houses down for the past 20 years. She was holding a USB drive in her weathered hands, and her usual warm smile was replaced by a look of quiet determination. "Art," she said, "I recorded everything from my kitchen window this morning. That woman, she lied to the police." Linda had immigrated to America in 1995, with nothing but her life savings and a determination to build a better life for her family. She'd bought her small house with cash, worked 2 jobs to pay it off early, and had been nothing but grateful for every opportunity this country had given her. In return, I'd been helping her with electrical repairs free of charge for years, because that's what neighbors do for each other. "Good people need to be defended," she said, pressing the USB drive into my hand. The video quality was crystal clear shot from her kitchen window with a perfect view of my property line. More importantly, it had audio. You could hear every word of Darlene's lies, every exaggeration, every false claim about feeling threatened. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the sheriff's department with a manila envelope full of evidence. The video, my property deed, the county survey from 2020, and the building permits I'd pulled 2 weeks earlier. Sheriff Martinez watched the footage twice, and I could see his jaw tighten as he listened to Darlene's fabricated story about feeling unsafe. Martinez had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times over his 20-year career. Wealthy homeowners using the police as their personal security force, filing false complaints against neighbors they wanted to intimidate or remove. The pattern was always the same. Fabricated safety concerns, exaggerated threats, and enough political connections to make his job complicated, even when the law was crystal clear. He'd watched good people get driven out of their homes by HOA harassment campaigns, forced to sell and move away, rather than fight expensive legal battles against neighbors with unlimited resources. But something about this case felt different. Art wasn't backing down, wasn't looking for an easy way out, and Martinez found himself hoping the young man would find a way to turn the tables on his entitled tormentor. "Son, I've been doing this job for 2 decades and I can smell a setup from a mile away. Problem is, county regulations still require me to follow procedure. I can't just reverse my decision based on new evidence without going through the proper channels." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples like he was fighting off a headache. "Here's what I can tell you unofficially. That lady's got connections in City Hall. This won't be your last headache. Give me until tomorrow morning to process this through the system and try to keep your head down in the meantime." As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Darlene wasn't going to wait until tomorrow morning to make her next move. I was right. By 3 o'clock, Darlene was working her phone like a campaign manager on election day. She called City Councilman Dave Richardson, who she'd met at the country club. She called the county planning director, whose sister happened to be her HOA attorney. She even called the local newspaper, spinning a story about community safety and property values. Her strategy was simple: frame me as a hostile neighbor, threatening the peaceful suburban lifestyle that people paid premium prices to enjoy. Within an hour, every member of our 47-person homeowners association had received an email with the subject line, "Emergency Safety Alert, Violent Neighbor Threatens Residents." When I pulled into my driveway at 4:30 p.m., I knew immediately that something was wrong. There was a fresh pile of construction debris dumped right in front of my garage door. Broken concrete with rusty rebar sticking out, paint cans leaking toxic sludge-rotting drywall that reeked of mold and chemicals. It would cost me at least $500 to have this mess properly disposed of, and that was assuming I could even find a company willing to handle hazardous materials on short notice. But the debris wasn't even the worst part. My brand new security cameras, the ones I'd installed just last month, after a string of break-ins in the area, were covered with thick black spray paint. The motion sensors had been disabled, and there was a note duct taped to my front door that said, "Get the message yet," in Darlene's perfectly manicured handwriting. This wasn't just retaliation. This was a declaration of war, and apparently she'd fired the first shot while I was sitting in the sheriff's office trying to follow proper procedure. By 6 p.m., the community isolation campaign was already showing results. Tom Wilson, who lived 3 houses down, called to cancel the electrical work I was supposed to do at his house tomorrow. "Sorry, Art, but my wife doesn't want any trouble with the HOA. You understand." No, I didn't understand, but I thanked him for calling and crossed another $300 off my weekly income. 20 minutes later, I was walking to my mailbox when Linda Hayes, who usually waved cheerfully during her evening walks, suddenly found something fascinating about her shoes and hurried past without making eye contact. That's when I found the first official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. Violation unsightly materials storage in violation of community aesthetic standards. Fine. $200. Payment due within 10 business days. They were fining me for the debris that Darlene had dumped on my property. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. She'd vandalized my property, then immediately wrote me a ticket for the mess she'd created. It was like getting punched in the face and then being arrested for bleeding on someone's fist. I sat on my front porch that evening, eating a microwaved dinner, and staring at the pile of toxic waste that someone had dumped in my driveway. For the first time since inheriting this property, I found myself wondering if maybe I should just cut my losses and move somewhere else. Somewhere without HOA Nazis and entitled neighbors who thought money could buy them the right to control other people's lives. Dad never had to deal with this kind of insanity. He'd bought this land back when neighbors still believed in minding their own business. But then I walked out to the old barn and ran my hand along my father's workbench, the same workbench where he'd taught me how to wire electrical outlets and fix broken appliances. I could almost hear his voice. "Son, running away teaches bullies that they can win. Sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing." I thought about Linda, who'd risked getting on Darlene's bad side just to help me get justice. I thought about all the other neighbors who were probably too scared to speak up against HOA intimidation. And I realized that this wasn't just about my fence anymore. I walked back to the house and found my security cameras still dripping with black paint. Someone had not only violated my property, but had deliberately blinded my security system while doing it. That's when I knew that tomorrow morning I'd be installing new cameras, hidden ones this time, because if Darlene wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had evidence of every single move she made. "Okay, lady," I said out loud, looking toward her mansion with its perfectly manicured lawn and pretentious marble columns. "If that's how you want to play this game, then game on. What exactly is Art's game going to be? Comment below who you think will win this war, Karen with her HOA power, or Art with his determination. Team Karen or Team Art? The harassment escalated over the next 3 nights, and each attack was more personal than the last. Night 1 around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a diesel truck rumbling in my driveway. By the time I got dressed and outside, whoever it was had already dumped another load of construction waste and disappeared into the darkness. This time, it was metal scraps with sharp edges, broken ceramic tiles, and chemical containers that made my eyes water just walking near them. I spent 3 hours cleaning it up the next morning, and another $400 having it properly disposed of. That afternoon, I installed my new security system. Military-grade night vision cameras, motion activation, cloud storage that uploaded everything in real time so no one could destroy the evidence. I positioned them carefully to avoid detection, hidden among the trees and fence posts where they'd capture everything but remain invisible to casual observation. If Darlene wanted to play dirty, I was going to document every second of it. Night 2 brought a different kind of violation. At 1:45 a.m., my hidden cameras caught a figure in dark clothing, slashing both rear tires on my work truck with a utility knife. The same figure then spray-painted "Move out or else" across my garage door in red letters 3 feet tall. When I discovered the damage at 6 a.m., I called Swooped away for the tires and spent $340 I didn't have on replacements. I filed a police report and got a case number, but Sheriff Martinez was honest about the challenges. Hard to prove anything without witnesses' art. Video from a distance in the dark won't be enough for criminal charges. My electrical business was starting to suffer serious damage. Another client called that afternoon to cancel a major rewiring job, saying he'd heard I was having issues with neighbors and didn't want to get involved in community drama. In a small town, reputation is everything, and mine was being systematically destroyed by someone who'd never done an honest day's work in her life. Darlene was using her social connections like weapons, turning my own community against me, one relationship at a time. But night 3 was when she crossed a line that changed everything between us. I'd been lying awake since midnight, knowing another attack was coming, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw starting up somewhere near my backyard. I threw on clothes and ran outside, but I was already too late. Darlene's landscaping crew was cutting down the 30-year-old oak tree that my father and I had planted together when I was 8 years old. The tree held every good memory I had of growing up on this property. When I was 8, and my mother died in a car accident, Dad and I planted that sapling together as a living memorial to her memory. "Son," he'd said, "this tree will outlive us both. It's our family legacy. Someday your children will swing from its branches." When I turned 15, he built a rope swing and hung it from the strongest branch, and we spent countless summer evenings there, him pushing me on the swing while he told stories about Mom and taught me about patience and character and doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Standing there at 3:20 a.m., watching strangers with chainsaws destroy 30 years of growth and memories, I felt something break inside my chest. That tree wasn't just wood and leaves to me. It was the last living connection to my mother who had died when I was 8 years old. Dad and I had planted it together on the first anniversary of her death, a tiny sapling that barely reached my knee. Every year on her birthday, we'd sit under its growing branches and Dad would tell me stories about her, laugh, her cooking her dreams for our family. When I graduated high school, we carved her initials in the bark. When Dad got sick, he'd spend hours in that rope swing talking to her memory, like she was still there listening. Now, Darlene had destroyed it like it was nothing, like 30 years of love and memory were just an inconvenience to her personal vendetta. The woman had no idea she'd just declared war on a dead woman's memorial. For the first time since Dad's funeral 2 years ago, I started crying. Not just tears, but deep body-shaking sobs that came from a place I'd been trying to keep locked away since the day we buried him. The tree crashed across my driveway with a sound like thunder taking out my roof gutter and crushing the fence I'd been trying to repair. $2,000 in damage easy, but the money wasn't what hurt. I picked up the chainsaw that one of the crew members had dropped in their hurry to escape, and for about 30 seconds I seriously considered marching over to Darlene's mansion and giving her a taste of what real intimidation felt like. My hands were shaking with rage, and I could feel 35 years of being reasonable and following rules and turning the other cheek just evaporating into pure fury. This woman had taken my mother's memorial tree. She'd destroyed the last physical connection I had to the best memories of my childhood. But then I heard Dad's voice in my head as clearly as if he was standing right beside me. "Son, the moment you let anger control your actions, you become everything they said you were." I set the chainsaw down and walked back into the house, my hands still trembling, but my mind starting to clear. If Darlene wanted to destroy my past, maybe it was time to start thinking about her future, specifically how to make sure she didn't have one in this neighborhood. I opened Dad's old trunk for the first time since his funeral, lifting out the manila folders where he kept every important document from 40 years of owning this property. Dad was obsessively organized, labeling everything by year, and subject keeping copies of contracts and receipts that most people would have thrown away decades ago. I was looking for the original property deed, hoping to find some detail that might help my legal case, when I found something much more interesting. There was a folder labeled Easement Agreement, Hartwell Property 2014. Inside was a 20-page contract between my father and Darlene's family, granting them an electrical easement across our property to connect their mansion to the power grid. The technical language was dense, full of legal terminology about grantor rights and grantee obligations, but my electrical training helped me understand the key concepts. Most of it was standard boilerplate language about maintenance responsibilities and property access rights. But there on page 3, buried in a paragraph of legal jargon, was a clause that made my heart start racing. Grantor permits electrical easement across property, provided grantee commits to no harassment or interference with property owner or family members. Violation of this provision renders entire agreement voidable at grantor's discretion. Dad hadn't just been generous when he allowed the Hartwells to run power lines across our land. He'd been smart. He'd built in a poison pill that would let him cut off their electricity the moment they started causing trouble. I spent the rest of the night researching easement law online, and what I learned made me smile for the first time in 3 days. The harassment clause wasn't just valid, it was ironclad. Every attack Darlene had made on my property, every lie she'd told to the police, every violation notice she'd sent through the HOA, all of it was documented evidence of contract violation. She'd been so focused on destroying me that she'd forgotten about the legal foundation her own power supply depended on. Around 4:30 a.m., I walked over to the kitchen window and looked across at Darlene's mansion. Every light was on, from the crystal chandeliers in the main hall to the underwater LEDs in the infinity pool. The landscape lighting alone probably cost more per month than most people's rent. $800 a month in electricity bills, easy. All of it flowing through power lines that crossed my property under a contract she'd just spent 3 days violating. I picked up the frame photo of my father from the kitchen table, the one taken the day we finished building the barn together. "Thanks, Dad," I whispered. "You always were 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Now I can turn off her lights legally." For the first time since this nightmare started, I had a plan. And unlike Darlene's campaign of harassment and intimidation, my plan was going to be completely, totally, absolutely legal. How can Art legally turn off someone's power? Comment your best guess about what Art found in those papers. First person to guess correctly gets a shout out in the next video. Day 5 started with Darlene hosting an emergency HOA meeting in her mansion's great room. 23 of our 47 homeowners showed up, which was actually a pretty good turnout for a community meeting about immediate safety concerns. I know this because Linda texted me updates from inside the meeting, where Darlene had prepared a full PowerPoint presentation about what she called the community security crisis threatening our property values. The presentation was masterfully manipulative. Photos of the construction debris that she had dumped on my property, labeled as evidence of neighborhood deterioration. Screenshots of my electrical permit applications described as unpermitted construction threatening community aesthetics. Even a pie chart showing declining property values in neighborhoods with hostile residents and inadequate HOA enforcement. She'd turned herself into the victim and me into the villain with nothing but selective editing and emotional manipulation. The vote wasn't even close. 18 members supported issuing me a formal warning for covenant violations and disruptive behavior, while only 5 voted against it. Linda stood up during the discussion and tried to defend me, explaining that she'd witnessed Darlene lying to the police, but she was shouted down by voices claiming she didn't understand American neighborhood values. She walked out halfway through the meeting, disgusted by the mob mentality and the willingness of decent people to turn against their neighbors based on fear and gossip. By 8 p.m. that evening, I was on the phone with Jake Morrison, my old college roommate, who had become a real estate attorney in Austin. "Jake, I need you to review an old easement agreement. It's complicated, and I think I might have found something important." Jake had always been the smart one in our friendship, the guy who could read a contract and immediately spot the loopholes and landmines that would trip up everyone else. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Art easements with harassment clauses are rare, but they're absolutely ironclad in Texas. If you can prove contract violation, you can terminate the entire agreement immediately. Are you sure you want to go nuclear? I thought about my mother's memorial tree now cut into pieces and hauled away like garbage. I thought about Linda, the sweetest woman in our neighborhood, being shouted down by a mob for trying to tell the truth. I thought about my father's voice. Sometimes, son, the right thing isn't the easy thing. Yeah, Jake, I said, I'm ready to go nuclear. Jake walked me through the legal process step by step. Jake's excitement was building as we talked through the details. Art, in 15 years of property law, I've never seen a harassment clause this ironclad. Your father was either incredibly lucky or incredibly smart when he negotiated this easement. Most people just sign whatever the power company puts in front of them, but your dad actually read the fine print and added protective language. This clause isn't just valid, it's bulletproof. Any documented harassment automatically voids the entire agreement, and Texas courts have consistently upheld similar provisions. Darlene's own actions have given you the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon. File a notice of easement termination due to material breach with the county clerk. Include a comprehensive evidence package, security camera footage, police reports, witness statements, documentation of property damage. If the county approved the termination, it would be immediate and binding. No appeals, no delays, no second chances. Day 6 started early with a trip to the courthouse. The county clerk, a middle-aged woman who'd probably processed thousands of property disputes over the years, reviewed my paperwork with professional thoroughness. Sir, if the court approves this termination, it takes effect immediately. The property owner loses all easement rights permanently. Are you certain you want to proceed? I signed the documents and paid the filing fee. By 10 a.m., my case was officially in the system. My next call was to the power company's customer service line. I need to discuss an easement termination affecting electrical service to a neighboring property. After being transferred twice, I reached their legal department, where a surprisingly helpful attorney explained their obligations. Sir, if you have a court-approved easement termination, we're legally required to disconnect service crossing your property within 24 hours. We can't ignore a valid legal order, even if it affects a customer's electricity. While I was building my legal case, Darlene was starting to panic. She'd learned about my courthouse visit from the county clerk's assistant, who happened to be the cousin of one of her HOA supporters. That afternoon, she called her attorney David Sterling, an expensive lawyer who specialized in property disputes for wealthy clients. But Sterling's assessment wasn't what she wanted to hear. Mrs. Hartwell, I'd need to see the original easement agreement to properly advise you. If there's a harassment clause and you've been documented violating its terms, an injunction would be very difficult to obtain. Darlene's response revealed everything about her character. I haven't harassed anyone. I'm protecting my community from a dangerous neighbor. Can't you just file something to stop him? Sterling tried to explain the reality of her situation. Injunctions require evidence of irreparable harm, and losing electrical access because you violated a contract doesn't qualify for emergency relief. The law doesn't protect people from the consequences of their own actions, especially when those actions directly violate legally binding agreements. That evening, I decided to give Darlene one final chance to resolve this situation like adults. I walked over to the property line where she was tending her prize-winning rose garden, the one that had won 3 consecutive community beautification awards. Darlene, I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful, this can end right now. All you have to do is issue a public apology for the harassment pay for replacing my tree and repairing the damage to my truck and property, and we can coexist peacefully. Her response told me everything I needed to know about her willingness to compromise. I don't apologize to people who threaten my community. This is my neighborhood governed by my standards, and you clearly don't belong here. She actually used the word my like she owned every house and every person in a 10-mile radius. You have no idea who you're messing with. I'll destroy your reputation, your business, and your future in this town. I looked at her for a long moment. This perfectly manicured woman in her designer clothes, standing in her $1-million garden, threatening to destroy the life of a working man whose only crime was wanting to fix his own fence. I tried diplomacy, Darlene. You chose pride over peace. That's your choice to make. I turned and walked back toward my house, but she wasn't finished talking. You think you can intimidate me? She called after me. I have connections you can't imagine. I'll have you run out of this county. I didn't turn around, didn't respond, didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing how much her threats bothered me. But I did smile because by 7 p.m., I had a text message from the county clerk. Mr. Thompson, judge approved your easement termination request. Effective 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. My final call of the day was to the power company's disconnect supervisor, Jim Rodriguez, who would be handling the actual termination. We'll need the sheriff present as a witness, he explained. Standard procedure for potentially hostile disconnections. But, sir, I have to tell you, this is the most legally sound revenge case I've seen in 15 years of doing this job. I stood on my porch that night, looking across at Darlene's mansion blazing with light. Every window glowing, every chandelier sparkling landscape lighting, illuminating her perfect gardens like a theme park. Tomorrow morning, all of that light would go dark, and it would stay dark until she spent tens of thousands of dollars to run new power lines around my property. Enjoy the light show, lady, I said softly. Tomorrow you learn what darkness feels like. Will Art really cut power to a $4 million mansion? Comment yes if you think he'll go through with it, or no if you think he'll chicken out. Let's see who knows Art better. 7 a.m. sharp on day 7, and my driveway looked like a scene from a movie about small-town justice. The power company truck arrived first, with technicians Mike and Carlos climbing out with their equipment and clipboards. Sheriff Martinez pulled up right behind them in his patrol car, followed by Linda, who'd brought a thermos of coffee, and announced she wouldn't miss this moment for the world. Word had spread through the neighborhood overnight, and by 6:45 we had 8 neighbors gathered with their phones out, some of them recording everything for posterity. Mike, the lead technician, walked over to inspect the electrical junction box on my property. He was probably in his 40s, with the kind of practical competence that comes from 20 years of connecting and disconnecting power for people who can't pay their bills or don't deserve electricity in the first place. Clean setup, sir, he said, studying the wiring configuration. Very professional installation. This will be a straightforward disconnect with no damage to the infrastructure. Carlos nodded in agreement, then added with a grin, most satisfying job we've had all month. That's when Darlene made her dramatic entrance. She came rushing out of her mansion at 6:45 a.m. wearing a terry cloth bathrobe, her usually perfect hair unwashed and wild, no makeup covering the dark circles under her eyes. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked exactly like what she was, a desperate person who had finally realized the consequences of her actions. The neighbors had never seen her anything less than perfectly put together, and the sight of their HOA queen looking human and vulnerable was almost as shocking as what was about to happen to her electricity. She immediately started working her phone like her life depended on it. First call went to her lawyer, David Sterling, but it was 7 a.m. on a Saturday, and she got his voicemail. Second call to the mayor's office, but City Hall wouldn't open until 8 a.m. Third call to her city councilman friend, Dave Richardson, but his phone went straight to voicemail, because apparently even corrupt politicians need their weekend sleep. Her fourth call was to her husband, Gary, who was in Dallas on a business trip. Honey, you need to come home right now. They're cutting our power. What do you mean? What did I do? Just get home. The crowd was growing. Bob Martinez, who lived 4 houses down, arrived with his morning coffee and announced to anyone who'd listen. She tried to fine me $500 for parking my work truck in my own driveway, claimed it violated community aesthetic standards. Sarah Williams chimed in, made my kids stop riding their bikes on the sidewalk because it disturbed her meditation garden. Mike Foster added his own story. Time someone stood up to this woman. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for 3 years. By 7 a.m. exactly, we had 12 neighbors forming a respectful semicircle around the electrical junction box. Some were applauding already, others were sharing their own Darlene horror stories, and a few were recording everything for social media. The atmosphere felt like a community event, like a 4th of July celebration or a neighborhood block party. Except instead of fireworks, we were about to watch justice get served with the flip of a switch. Sheriff Martinez walked over to where I was standing next to the electrical box. Art, I need to ask you one final time. Are you absolutely certain about this decision? Once I give the okay for this disconnect, there's no going back. She'll be without power until she can afford to run new lines around your property, and that's going to cost her tens of thousands of dollars. I looked across the crowd at the stump, where my father's oak tree used to stand, where my mother's memorial had grown for 30 years, before Darlene decided it was inconvenient for her personal vendetta. I thought about Linda being shouted down at the HOA meeting for trying to tell the truth. I thought about my electrical business suffering because of lies and manipulation. I thought about my father's voice, justice comes through the system, son, but when the system works, it works completely. Sheriff, I said, My dad taught me that justice isn't about revenge, it's about consequences. This woman destroyed my mother's memorial tree, vandalized my property, lied to the police, and tried to destroy my livelihood because I wouldn't sell her my family's land. Every action has consequences, and today she learns what hers are. Darlene must have heard me talking to the sheriff because she came rushing over with tears streaming down her face. Real tears, probably the first genuine emotion she'd shown since this whole mess started. Art, please. We can work something out. I'll pay for everything. Double, triple. I'll replace your tree with the most beautiful landscaping you've ever seen. Just don't do this. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had spent a week trying to destroy my life because I wouldn't hand over my inheritance to satisfy her sense of entitlement. I offered you that chance yesterday evening, Darlene. You chose pride over peace. You told me I didn't belong in your neighborhood and threatened to destroy my reputation and my business. Those were your words, not mine. Her desperation was complete now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. You can't do this to me. Do you have any idea who I am? I have connections throughout this county. I'll make sure you never work in this town again. Even facing the complete collapse of her comfortable life, she still couldn't resist threatening me. Still couldn't resist trying to use her wealth and connections as weapons against someone she considered beneath her. Yeah, Darlene, I said quietly. I know exactly who you are. You're the woman who just lost her power. I put my hand on the main electrical breaker that controlled the flow of electricity from the city grid through my property to her mansion. The crowd went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. For just a moment, the entire world held its breath. Then I flipped the switch down. Click. The sound of that switch clicking echoed across the neighborhood like a gunshot. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened, and I wondered if somehow the power company had made a mistake. Then the changes began cascading through Darlene's mansion like dominoes falling. First, the constant hum of the central air conditioning units went silent. Then the pool pumps stopped circulating water. The landscape lighting that had illuminated her gardens like a theme park every night for 3 years died instantly. Inside the house, I could see the glow from her crystal chandeliers fade to black, and her security system started beeping its emergency battery warning. The crowd behind me erupted in spontaneous applause, but all I could hear was the beautiful sound of absolute silence from the direction of her property. After a week of harassment, vandalism, and intimidation, justice finally had its moment to speak. The effect was immediate and total. The constant hum of air conditioning units stopped. The pool pumps went quiet. The landscape lighting died. 8,000 square feet of mansion plunged into darkness, and the only sound was Darlene's sobbing and the spontaneous applause from 12 neighbors who'd been waiting years for someone to stand up to the neighborhood bully. Mike, the technician, shook my hand. Sir, that was the most satisfying disconnect I've done in 15 years on this job. Carlos was grinning from ear to ear. Lady had it coming. Sheriff Martinez nodded approvingly. Clean, legal, and completely justified. Your father would be proud. The immediate cost to Darlene was staggering. $47,000 to run new electrical service around my property, assuming she could get the permits. 8 to 12 weeks for installation, during which she'd need generator rental at $800 per week, just for basic power. Hotel costs during the Texas summer heat, because no generator powerful enough to run central air conditioning. Food spoilage from refrigerator failure, security system replacement, property value dropping by $200,000 due to the electrical issues. But the real cost was deeper than money. It was the complete loss of respect from her community, the public humiliation of being defeated by the working-class neighbor she'd tried to destroy, and the knowledge that her own actions had caused every bit of suffering she was about to endure. The psychological impact on Darlene was immediate and devastating. This was a woman who'd built her entire identity around control status and the ability to bend others to her will through wealth and intimidation. Watching her neighbors applaud her public humiliation, seeing her carefully constructed image of authority crumble in real time, broke something fundamental in her worldview. She sat on those front steps for 2 hours after the crowd dispersed, staring at her dark house like she couldn't comprehend how her perfect life had collapsed so completely. The HOA queen who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood with violation notices and threats had been defeated by the very legal system she'd tried to weaponize against others. Her long-standing influence over the neighborhood had come to an end by a working man with a toolbox and his father's old paperwork. Gary pulled into the driveway just as the crowd was dispersing, took one look at the dark house and his sobbing wife, and said the words that summed up the entire situation. Honey, what the hell did you do? How will Darlene survive without power in a Texas summer? Comment if you think this was too harsh or if Karen deserved every second of this. Also, should Art forgive her if she truly apologizes? 3 weeks later, the transformation of our neighborhood was complete, and not in the way Darlene had envisioned when she started her campaign against me. Week 1 after the power cut was like watching a slow-motion collapse of everything she'd built her identity around. The generator she rented cost $1,200 per week in fuel costs, running 18 hours per day, just to keep the refrigerator and basic lighting operational. The Texas summer heat made the house uninhabitable without air conditioning, forcing her and Gary to spend $300 per night at the downtown hotel just to sleep in comfort. Week 2 brought the for sale sign planted in her previously pristine front lawn like a white flag of surrender. The realtor was honest about the challenges electrical problems scare away 80% of potential buyers, and the remaining 20% want massive price reductions to compensate for the inconvenience and expense of fixing the power situation. The initial listing price dropped $150,000 below market value, then dropped another $50,000 when the first month passed without any serious offers. Week 3 delivered the final blow to Darlene's reign of terror. Gary filed separation papers citing irreconcilable differences and financial irresponsibility stemming from unnecessary legal disputes. When he moved into a downtown apartment, taking half their assets and leaving Darlene to face the consequences of her actions alone. The woman who had spent years controlling every aspect of our neighborhood's appearance and behavior couldn't even control her own marriage. The HOA held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Darlene from all leadership positions, with only her own vote dissenting. Linda was elected as the new president, running on a platform of helping neighbors instead of harassing them. Her first official act was to eliminate the ridiculous aesthetic violation policies that had been used as weapons against working-class residents who couldn't afford mansion-level landscaping and luxury cars. My electrical business experienced the opposite trajectory. Word spread quickly about the guy who legally cut power to the HOA queen, and my phone started ringing with calls from people who had been waiting years for someone to stand up to, entitled homeowners and abusive neighborhood associations. I was booked solid for 3 months in advance, with clients driving from other counties just to hire the electrician who'd beaten the system using the system's own rules. On a warm evening exactly 1 month after cutting Darlene's power, I was sitting on my newly renovated front porch with an ice-cold beer, enjoying the peaceful silence that had returned to our neighborhood. My house glowed with warm yellow light from every window, the sound of a baseball game drifting out from my living room, and my dog Moose sleeping contentedly at my feet. Linda waved from her kitchen window, and I could see families in other houses going about their normal evening routines without fear of HOA harassment or violation notices. Next door, Darlene's mansion sat in complete darkness and absolute silence. The for sale sign had been tilted by last week's storm and never straightened. The automatic sprinkler system had failed without electricity, leaving brown patches in her once perfect lawn. The infinity pool was covered with a tarp, and the landscape lighting that used to illuminate her gardens like a theme park was just dead metal fixtures collecting dust and spiderwebs. I raised my beer toward my father's photo, visible through the living room window, and spoke the words that had been building in my heart for weeks. Here's to good fences making good neighbors, Dad, but next time I'm reading all the fine print first. I took a long drink and smiled at the perfect irony of it all. And Karen, wherever you end up next, remember to read yours too. But what happened to Darlene after she lost everything?